108 Japanese aircraft rumble across the sky. Zeros, Kates, and Vals slice through the clouds, unveiling the American strips on Midway Atoll. Their objective is clear: destroy the grounded bombers and fighters, crater the runways, and silence the island's defenses. But as explosions rip across a small island, the skies above Midway are quiet. A troubling question echoes across the cockpits of the Japanese airmen. Where are the American planes? Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy seized the strategic initiative. With Allied forces reeling, Japan's leaders saw boundless opportunity across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The American and British navies were overstretched, as they struggled to mount a response. Japanese forces soon began capturing territory from the Philippines to Malaya and the Dutch East Indies. At the heart of this offensive was the Kido Butai, a powerful strike force centered around 6 fleet carriers that overpowered any naval force that tried to resist them. Above the fleet, nimble Japanese planes and skillful pilots outflew and outgunned their opponents, driving the Japanese Navy's momentum across the Pacific. Though flushed with success, Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, ever the gambler, argued that the Imperial Navy needed to land another decisive blow. Pearl Harbor was a victory, there was no doubt about that, but the US aircraft carriers were unharmed, while the submarine base and massive fuel tanks remained unscathed, meaning the American naval forces were still a threat. Yamamoto was well aware that American industrial capabilities far exceeded those of Japan. The war needed to end soon, before the American industry could overwhelm Japan's. A second crushing naval defeat was needed to force the US to come to terms, since they would have no real way to fight back. The question remained how to accomplish this. For Yamamoto, the answer was simple: destroy the US carriers. When Admiral Chester Nimitz was appointed Commander-in-Chief Pacific, he arrived at Pearl Harbor to survey the wreckage. Battleships were sunk or crippled, aircraft losses were severe, and morale was low. After declaring war against Germany and Japan in December 1941, the American public called for revenge. But the Navy had few options. With most of the battle line destroyed, only untested carriers and scatter air groups remained. Nimitz was a pragmatist, however, and immediately ordered the dispersal of available carrier forces to conduct raids on Japanese outposts. He hoped to divide and distract these superior Japanese battle groups while minimizing risk to his own. In the meantime, American industry would make up for losses, though this would take time. And for now, the Navy needed a hard blow to keep Japan off balance. With both sides itching for a fight, events over the ensuing months accelerated the Japanese motivation for a decisive battle. On April 18, 1942, U.S. Army Air Forces Major James Doolittle launched his B-25 Mitchell Bomber Squadron on a one-way attack from the deck of the USS Hornet. Packed with as many bombs as they could carry, the 16-plane squadron gunned for the Japanese capital of Tokyo. In a daring act of revenge, the bombs dropped their payloads on the unsuspecting city, bringing the war to Japan's doorstep. Bombs landed not only on Tokyo, but on Yokosuka, Nagoya, and Kobe as well. Incensed that the United States had struck the capital, the Imperial Navy finalized its plan to destroy the American carriers for good. Codenamed Operation MI, Yamamoto's plan called for a massive ambush in the waters near Midway Island, an atoll home to the US Navy, Marine Corps, and Army Air Forces squadrons. Japanese formations would travel separately and then converge in an arc, stretching from the northwest to the southwest of Midway. While en route, the Japanese Navy and Army also planned an aerial and naval assault on the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. They assumed US forces would be too distracted by an in-progress invasion to notice Operation MI unfolding in the Central Pacific. Northwest of Midway, carrier-based fighters from the Kido Butai would sweep over the atoll and demolish parked aircraft along with any local defenses. Yamamoto expected Nimitz to respond by dispatching his carriers from Pearl Harbor to rescue the atoll. Here, the Imperial Navy would spring its trap. Japanese naval air forces would strike and sink the carriers, while a powerful surface fleet mopped up the remaining ships and ground troops landed to seize the atoll. The Battle of Coral Sea in May 1942 set the stage for Yamamoto's gambit. American forces disrupted the planned Japanese invasion of Port Moresby, inflicting losses on dozens of aircraft, sinking the light carrier Shoho, damaging the fleet carrier Shokaku, and depleting the air group of the Zoikaku. These gains came at the cost of the USS Lexington and heavy damage to Yorktown. However, Japanese losses meant that the Kido Butai would be weaker going into its next operation. Believing the US carrier fleet to be in peril, Yamamoto rolled the dice and set Operation MI in motion. Nimitz was not as much of a risk taker as Yamamoto, but he was willing to take chances when he could hedge his bets. Nimitz knew that a Japanese attack was coming. Signals intelligence gathered by a Navy unit nicknamed Hypo was steadily unraveling Japan's operational plans. American codebreakers had begun to crack the Imperial Navy's current cipher, known as JN-25. By May 1942, US Navy intelligence officers could decipher most of the current Japanese naval military code. After putting together various enemy reports and fleet movements, intelligence personnel advised Nimitz that an impending invasion of the Aleutian Islands was likely, and that the Kido Butai was going to attack Midway in an attempt to ambush the American carriers. On the surface, Nimitz's ready carrier force was outnumbered 2-1. Enemy movements forced him to contemplate desperate measures. He banked on two key factors to even the odds. First was Midway's aircraft compensating for a missing carrier, while the other was the rapid repair of the USS Yorktown, which Nimitz wanted back in action and ready to even the playing field. With foreknowledge of the oncoming attack, Nimitz had prepared his own trap. Constant reconnaissance flights and submarine pickets would warn US forces when the Japanese fleet steamed close to Midway. Task Force 16, under Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, and Task Force 17, under Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, quietly slipped out of Pearl Harbor and sailed to Point Luck, 300 miles or 483 kilometers northeast of Midway. There, they would wait to strike the unsuspecting Kido Butai if, as Nimitz cautioned, the opportunity was right. Japanese commanders, for their part, discounted any possibility that the Americans might get the jump on them. Japanese admirals even conducted a war game from May 2nd to May 5th, and during the exercise, an officer sent the US fleet to flank the Japanese carrier group before it arrived. The game's referee disqualified the move, stating it was too implausible. To hedge his bets in the real battle, Yamamoto ordered the carrier group commander, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, to arm half of his planes with torpedoes and the other half with bombs for a ground attack on Midway's defenses. Yamamoto himself would sail with the main body of battleships and heavy cruisers some distance away under radio silence. That meant Nagumo would have to command the carriers alone, without direct support or oversight. The Armada left Japanese shores on May 27th. Despite their confidence, not everything was going to plan. The Japanese submarine cordons, meant to monitor US naval activity, were delayed in reaching their patrol zones. As a result, they missed the US carriers departing Pearl Harbor. Even when a submarine later reported sighting the US fleet near Point Luck, Yamamoto didn't pass the message to Nagumo. He instead maintained radio silence and assumed that Nagumo had received the message. Nagumo believed the American carriers were still positioned at Pearl Harbor. Nagumo's assessment was further clouded by a storm front rolling in, as bad weather and heavy fog masked the approach of the Kido Butai and main body, meaning they could not launch long-range patrol and observation aircraft right away. Japanese forces were sailing blind. The need for sharp tactics and intelligence was crucial in compensating for technological limitations. Radar, although present, was rudimentary and had limited coverage. To locate the enemy, patrol craft had to fly sweeping search patterns to visually identify enemy formations and then return to report their findings, relying on little more than maps, compasses, and a keen eye during the daylight hours. Night flying was virtually impossible under these conditions, meaning carrier-based aircraft could only engage in combat during the day. Both sides were grasping for each other across vast stretches of ocean, hoping to strike first. These operations were perilous. Pilots could get lost, run out of fuel, or suffer mechanical failures and vanish into the open ocean, never to be seen again. Once carrier task forces located enemy fleets, the opposing carriers became the highest value targets. Fighters were tasked with clearing enemy patrol aircraft from the skies, creating an opening for strike groups to move in. Meanwhile, teams of dive bombers would swoop down from thousands of feet above sea level at a 70-degree angle to punch a single bomb through a carrier's wooden decks. Torpedo bombers would fly low and slow, skimming just above the waters to drop their heavy and fragile payloads against a ship's vulnerable flanks. A well-coordinated attack could be deadly. Japanese naval airmen practiced these tactics, and Japanese commanders preferred a well-organized assault over piecemeal attacks. American naval air commanders, by contrast, often deviated from doctrine and improvised under pressure when coordination broke down. At 09:05 hours on June 3rd, American patrol aircraft spotted elements of the approaching invasion force. Search planes and long-range bombers first located the transport and support groups, prompting immediate strikes. By 15:30 hours, B-17s led the attack, dropping their payloads from high altitude, but Japanese captains skillfully maneuvered their ships, and the bombs fell haplessly into the sea. A torpedo run by one Catalina on June 4th at 0100 scored a minor success, lightly damaging a Japanese fleet oiler. But it revealed a deeper problem. The Mark 13 torpedoes used by US forces were notoriously unreliable. It was an ominous sign for the battles to come. Once the Kido Butai was located by reconnaissance aircraft on June 4th at 534 hours, it was all the justification needed to launch every available heavy bomber and attack aircraft from Midway. Flights of B-17s and B-26s roared skyward as they climbed to high altitude, while ground-based scout and torpedo bombers raced off on attack runs. The American carriers, however, held back. Midway Island's position was no secret, but the carriers' position was. They would wait for the right opportunity to strike the Japanese fleet in one single blow. The Japanese attack was already on its way to strike Midway since 0430 hours. Unbeknownst to Admiral Nagumo, American bombers were on their way to attack him. Japanese aircraft blanketed the island at 0630. Ground troops fired anti-aircraft guns at the attackers, and small groups of American fighters scrambled to harry Japanese bombers. When the bombing run was complete, the Japanese air commander over Midway observed that the damage was insufficient. He calculated that a second wave was necessary and advised Nagumo accordingly. Nagumo ordered the carrier air wings to begin the laborious process of unequipping torpedoes and loading the Kates with bombs for ground attack. The changeover would take at least 2 hours, especially as friendly planes returned to their carriers. At 0620 hours, the American carriers massing at Point Luck finally received the intelligence they were hoping for: the location and bearing of the Kido Butai. 50 minutes later, American bombers from Midway rumbled overhead and dropped their payloads on the Japanese carrier group. Once again, Japanese seamanship was impressive, twisting and turning around the bombing paths into well-timed arcs despite their size. Entire stacks of bombs missed, exploding into high columns of water far away from Japanese ships. Aboard the carrier Akagi, Admiral Nagumo faced a moment of deep uncertainty. Operation MI now teetered on a knife's edge. His orders were clear: neutralize Midway's defenses before engaging any approaching American carriers. But the timing had turned against him. Ill-fated American strikes, though ineffective, had forced his hand. Minutes earlier, he had ordered his reserve strike force to be rearmed with bombs for a second attack on the island. Now, that same force was needed to respond to a potential carrier threat. Below deck, crews scrambled to swap out torpedoes, recover returning aircraft, and rearm in cramped, chaotic conditions. Reversing course now would mean more delays, more confusion, and more risk, yet every passing minute narrowed his options. Nagumo had no time to ponder the finer points of strategy, as waves of high-altitude bombers, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers began assaulting his formation at 07:55 hours for nearly half an hour. Uncoordinated and vulnerable, these piecemeal attacks from US forces were easily parried aside or dodged. American casualties mounted, especially among the torpedo bombing squadrons. Anti-aircraft fire downed some planes, while the nimble Zeros raked through vulnerable and unescorted bomber formations. Nagumo himself had a close call when a damaged B-26 lost flight control and hurtled down toward the Akagi's command tower, narrowly missing it. The Battle of Midway marked a turning point in the Pacific, with bombers and torpedo planes launched from the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown helping to secure victory. This year, as the US Navy celebrates its 250th anniversary, World of Warships PC is honoring this legacy with a massive in-game event packed with missions, rewards, and exclusive content. Starting in October, players can build Liberty Harbor, an interactive naval base that unlocks key moments in Navy history, upgrade facilities, send ships on expeditions, and collect naval base supplies to earn prizes, including the brand new epic Tier 8 premium cruiser Bridgeport. New players who join using code STEPUP250 instantly unlock the American Tier 3 cruiser St. Louis, 20 days of premium time, a port slot, and a commander. Complete the Navy 250 missions for even more rewards, like the Tier 7 cruiser Boise, 7 super containers, 40 million credits, 1 million elite commander XP, 600,000 free XP, and 25 rare expendable economic bonuses of each type. Returning players rejoining the fight can claim special rewards only available during this event, tackle Liberty Harbor missions to collect valuable items, and dive back in with fresh ships and content. World of Warships PC is a massive multiplayer free-to-play PC game with over 400 historically accurate destroyers, cruisers, battleships, and aircraft carriers. Jump straight into the action on more than 20 maps with over 8 million players worldwide. Support our channel by clicking the link in the description and sign up for World of Warships PC today for free. Some hundreds miles east, American carrier crews labored slowly to get their squadrons into the air. It took over an hour for the USS Enterprise and USS Hornet under Admiral Spruance to position and launch their combat wings. Once airborne, it would take them nearly 2 hours to reach their destination. At 0820, Nagumo received word that American carriers had been spotted. Reversing course now, after already ordering his planes rearmed for a second wave on Midway, would create further delays and confusion. Though his crews were efficient, the mix of returning aircraft, refueling fighters, and rearming operations made launching a new strike extremely difficult. Meanwhile, continued American attacks drained fuel, disrupted flight cycles, and robbed Nagumo of the initiative. Continual pressure was exactly what Admirals Spruance and Fletcher hoped to accomplish. Their goal was to disrupt Japanese battle doctrine and prevent a coordinated counterstrike. As the air wings of Task Forces 16 and 17 fanned out in search of Nagumo's carrier group, several groups became lost along the way and were forced to ditch. Still, the flights pressed on, each at their own pace. Lacking coordination, the various fighter, dive bomber, and torpedo groups arrived over the Japanese fleet in scattered independent waves. The torpedo bombers arrived first, but their slow speed made them easy pickings. The obsolete TBD Douglas Devastators couldn't match the performance of the Japanese Zeros. Even if they survived interception or anti-aircraft fire, many of their launched Mark 13 torpedoes turned out to be duds. The accompanying Wildcats were little help too. Outclassed by the Zeros, they couldn't provide adequate cover for the Devastators. Still, the effect of these piecemeal attacks was significant, even as entire squadrons were decimated. Japanese defensive fighters were busy, tied up with all of the threats harrying the carriers. They were running low on fuel and had to protect incoming squadrons landing on the decks. Then, in a matter of minutes, the battle turned. At 10:20 hours, American dive bombers arrived without the Japanese forces detecting them. IGN carriers lacked radar and relied on visual observation, which failed them at this critical moment. 28 SBD Dauntlesses, led by Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, had been searching for the Kido Butai and now saw their chance to strike 3 carriers at once. While the Zeros were busy hunting down the hapless Devastators, they missed the Dauntlesses screaming down on the Akagi, Soryu, and Kaga. Each carrier was a floating powder keg, its hangars packed to the brim with munitions and armed aircraft, while fuel crowded the decks. A well-placed bomb could destroy the entire ship. For Nagumo, the worst possible outcome became real. As before, his captains maneuvered their ships in sudden and unpredictable turns. It was to no avail. The Kaga took 5 direct hits and was quickly engulfed in flames. The Akagi took a single well-placed hit right into the fuel and munition-laden hangar deck. The resulting explosion ignited a chain reaction that devastated the carrier. The Soryu was the next to feel the dive bomber's fury. Scrambling to dodge the falling bombs, she took 3 hits across her entire length. One Japanese sailor commented that the Soryu appeared as if she had been cut in half. Only the Hiryu remained unscathed, though not for lack of American efforts. By the time attacks subsided, one of the most feared groups of warships in the Pacific was left ablaze. Though each carrier differed slightly in construction, their damage control methods were limited, especially compared to their American counterparts. Water pumps failed, coordination broke down, and fires spread rapidly, igniting volatile fuel and munitions deep within the ships. The carriers were dead in the water. Nagumo survived the attack, transferring his command from the Akagi to a nearby cruiser. With Nagumo's consent, the remaining carrier's commander, Vice Admiral Yamaguchi Tamon, directed a counterattack on the recently discovered Yorktown. Though they had lost 3 carriers, Nagumo and Yamaguchi refused to concede defeat. With every plane they could muster from the Hiryu, 18 Vals and 6 Zeros, the mortally wounded Kido Butai set Task Force 17 in its sights, hoping to lure in the American ships and destroy them with the main body. At noon, Yorktown's radar picked up the inbound attack force. Combat air patrols and fighter squadrons hurried to intercept them. Wildcats shot down 11 of the 18 Vals dive bombers into the sea. But in the chaos above Task Force 17, 7 managed to slip through the anti-aircraft cordon. 3 bombs struck Yorktown. Damage control crews moved quickly to contain the fires and prevent catastrophic destruction. But by 12:40 p.m., the carrier had lost propulsion and was dead in the water. Fletcher, like Nagumo, moved his command to a nearby cruiser, reportedly complaining that he was too old for this sort of thing. Sailors worked feverishly to restore power, and Yorktown's engines limped to life again. The reprieve was short-lived, however, as 10 Kates encircled the crippled ship and honed in for an attack. Japanese torpedoes were deadly effective, and, with limited interference from American fighters, struck Yorktown again, putting her out of action for good. Nagumo clung to the hope that this air attack could draw the enemy carriers in and place them within range for a surface fleet battle. Main body forces trailed nearby, waiting for the opportunity, but his plans quickly fell through as American dive bombers surprised the Hiryu. 3 bombs damaged its flight deck so severely that it was inoperable. Later on at midnight, an internal explosion rattled the ship. She was abandoned and later sunk by a Japanese destroyer. By the end of June 4th, 5 fleet carriers had been knocked out of action, 4 Japanese and 1 American. But the danger wasn't over. Submarines on both sides prowled the seas, delivering final blows to crippled ships like the Kaga and Yorktown, sometimes hours or days after the major air battles. Yamamoto and Fletcher believed that further combat might have been warranted, but caution prevailed. Fletcher followed his orders to not risk the fleet, while Yamamoto had to protect his forces without air cover. Each side traded blows through submarine attacks or limited airstrikes on June 5th, but by the next day, naval forces around Midway had begun to withdraw. The frantic combat around and above Midway Atoll set the Imperial Navy and the US Navy on wildly different trajectories. The Japanese could no longer challenge the US Navy without the Kido Butai and its pilots. The Empire was forced to defend. Meanwhile, the US Navy rapidly recovered its losses and could dictate the terms of engagement in the Pacific. The war was far from over. Hard fighting remained, but the US held the upper hand.